They called it the eyesore. That tattered canvas structure standing in the middle of Orville Banks's property, torn and weathered, flapping in the wind like a flag of defeat. The whole town knew about it. Sterling Maddox made sure of that. Every time someone new arrived, he would point toward the distant property and laugh. That piece of filthy fabric had become more famous than Orville himself, a monument to failure that the town couldn't stop talking about. But what none of them knew, what not a single soul in that settlement could have imagined, was that beneath that ridiculous shelter lay something that would change everything. The question wasn't why Orville kept it. The question was what he was protecting. Orville stood at the edge of his land, watching the settlement in the distance. The midday sun beat down on his shoulders, warming the worn fabric of his shirt. His hands, calloused from years of work, held a worn piece of rope he had been using to secure the canvas structure once again. The wind had torn it loose during the night. It always did. And every morning, Orville would walk out there and tie it back down, ignoring the way people stared from the road, ignoring the comments he knew they made. Rust sat beside him, the dog's reddish coat catching the light. The animal had been restless all morning, pacing around the canvas structure, sniffing the ground with an intensity that seemed unusual even for him. Orville had noticed this behavior growing stronger over the past few weeks. The dog would circle the same spot, scratch at the dirt, whine softly when Orville called him away. It was the same area every time, directly beneath the center of the torn shelter. The sound of a wagon approaching made Orville turn. Sterling Maddox drove past on the main road, close enough that Orville could see the smirk on his face. The merchant didn't even try to hide his contempt anymore. He slowed the wagon deliberately, making a show of looking at the canvas structure, shaking his head with exaggerated disappointment before moving on. Two other men rode with him, both laughing at something Sterling had said. Orville could guess what it was. He turned back to his work, pulling the rope tight. The canvas was old, older than most people realized. His father had maintained this structure before him, always in this exact spot, always with the same careful attention. Orville remembered his father's final words, spoken with an urgency that had haunted him ever since. Never abandon this place, never sell this land, no matter what they offer, no matter what they say. His father had gripped his arm with surprising strength for a dying man, eyes intense with something Orville couldn't name. There are things here worth more than money, things that need protecting. At the time, Orville had assumed his father meant the land itself, the memories, the family legacy. But as years passed and the settlement grew around him, as his property became surrounded by prosperity while he struggled, Orville began to wonder if there was something more. His father had been insistent about this specific location, about keeping the canvas structure exactly where it stood, about never letting anyone dig here, or build here, or disturb the ground. Rust barked suddenly, a sharp sound that cut through Orville's thoughts. The dog was digging now, his front paws working furiously at the dirt beneath the canvas. Orville walked over and tried to pull him away, but Rust resisted, something he rarely did. The dog's whole body was tense with focus, his nose pressed against the ground as if he could smell something deep below the surface. Orville knelt down, running his hand over the area where Rust had been digging. The dirt felt the same as always, packed hard from years of weather. But there was something different about this spot, something he had never noticed before. The ground here didn't settle quite right. When he pressed down with his palm, there was a subtle give, a slight hollow feeling that suggested empty space below. He sat back on his heels, staring at the disturbed earth. His father's words echoed in his mind. Things worth more than money. Orville looked toward the settlement where Sterling Maddox's wagon had disappeared from view, where the whole town saw him as nothing more than a stubborn fool clinging to worthless land. They mocked his torn tent, laughed at his poverty, pitied his isolation. But what if they were wrong about everything? What if that ridiculous canvas shelter that brought him so much shame was actually marking something they couldn't begin to understand? Rust whined again, looking up at Orville with those intelligent eyes, then back down at the ground. The dog knew something, and for the first time in years, Orville wondered if maybe he was about to find out what his father had been protecting all along. The morning air carried the smell of dust and dry grass as Orville made his way into the settlement. He needed supplies, basic things he could barely afford, and the trip always filled him with a familiar dread. Walking down the main road meant exposing himself to stares and whispers, to the judgment of people who had decided long ago what kind of man he was. Sterling Maddox stood outside his general store, talking with Wade Langston and two other men. They stopped their conversation as Orville approached, their silence more cutting than any insult. Sterling's eyes traveled to Orville's worn boots, his patched trousers, the shirt that had been mended too many times to count. The merchant's expression was one of calculated amusement, like someone watching a performance they had seen many times before. Orville kept his head level and walked into the store. Inside, the cool darkness was a brief relief. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with goods that seemed impossibly abundant compared to the emptiness of his own home. He gathered what he needed quickly, counting his coins carefully at the counter. Sterling had followed him inside, positioning himself behind the register with the air of someone about to deliver a rehearsed speech. "Still holding onto that worthless patch of dirt?" Sterling said, his voice loud enough to carry to the other customers browsing nearby. "Wade offered you fair money last month. More than fair, considering what you've got." Orville placed his coins on the counter without responding. Sterling counted them slowly, making a show of the small amount. The merchant leaned forward, lowering his voice to something that might have sounded like concern to anyone who didn't know him better. "That canvas tent of yours is falling apart. Whole town can see it from the road. Makes the place look worse than it is, if that's even possible." "I'll manage," Orville said quietly. Sterling shook his head, sliding the supplies across the counter. "You've been managing for 10 years now. Look where it's got you." He gestured around the store, at the abundance surrounding them. "Meanwhile, some of us know how to turn opportunity into prosperity. That land of yours could be worth something in the right hands." "It's worth something in mine," Orville replied, gathering his purchases. As he turned to leave, Wade Langston blocked his path. The younger man had an eager quality about him, an ambition that showed in every calculated movement. "I'll make you another offer," Wade said. "Double what I offered last month. You could start fresh somewhere else, somewhere people don't know about your circumstances." Orville met his eyes. "I'm not selling." "You're being foolish," Wade pressed. "That property can't sustain itself. Everyone knows it. You're barely scraping by. What are you holding on to? Some misguided loyalty to your father's memory?" The mention of his father sent a flicker of something through Orville's chest. His father had stood in this very store countless times, enduring similar conversations, similar pressure, and he had never once wavered in his refusal to sell. Orville understood now, with a clarity that had come from kneeling in that dirt yesterday, that his father had known something these men could never comprehend. "My reasons are my own," Orville said, stepping around Wade and out into the sunlight. Harriet Weller stood near the boardwalk with 2 other women, their conversation stopping as he passed. One of them laughed behind her hand, a sound designed to be heard. Orville didn't turn, didn't acknowledge it, but the shame burned in his stomach like swallowed fire. He had carried this burden for so long that it had become part of him, this weight of being the town's favorite example of failure. As he passed Nora Talbot's boarding house on his way out of the settlement, he noticed her watching from her window. She didn't wave or call out, but her expression held something different from the others. Not pity, but understanding. She had weathered her own share of judgment from this town after her husband died, and she chose to maintain her independence rather than remarry as everyone expected. Perhaps that was why she had never joined the mockery. But something had shifted yesterday. That moment when rust had dug into the ground, when Orville had felt the hollow space beneath his hand, a door had opened in his understanding. His father's insistence on keeping that exact spot marked, his refusal to let anyone disturb the ground, his final words about things worth more than money, it all pointed to something deliberate, something planned. Orville walked back toward his property, the weight of supplies in his arms nothing compared to the weight of what he was beginning to suspect. His father had been protecting something. Not just the land, not just the family legacy, but something specific, something physical, something hidden beneath that torn canvas shelter that everyone in town saw as a symbol of defeat. The question that had kept him awake through the night returned with renewed force. What had his father known? And why had he chosen to keep it secret, even from his own son, until those final moments when death had loosened his tongue just enough to plant the seed of warning? Orville reached the edge of his property and paused, looking at the canvas structure in the distance. From here, it looked exactly as Sterling had described it. Torn, weathered, pathetic, a mark of failure visible for miles. But Orville was starting to see it differently now, not as a symbol of what he lacked, but as a marker of what lay beneath, a deliberate flag, placed by his father, and maintained through years of ridicule and pressure, standing guard over something that no one else could see. Rust appeared from behind the structure, tail wagging, dirt on his muzzle from more digging. The dog had been working at that spot all morning, Orville realized. While he had been enduring humiliation in town, Rust had been there, faithful and persistent, following instincts that ran deeper than human understanding. Orville set down his supplies and walked toward the canvas structure, his heart beating faster with each step. The hollow ground, his father's warning, Rust's obsessive digging. It all pointed to one inevitable conclusion. There was something down there, something important enough to protect for decades, something worth all the shame and struggle and isolation. And Orville was going to find out what it was. Orville waited until nightfall to begin digging. He had no reason to hide his actions on his own land, but something in him demanded privacy for this moment. The canvas structure provided some cover from the road, and the darkness would shield him from curious eyes that might pass by. Rust sat nearby, watching with an alertness that suggested the dog understood something important was happening. The shovel bit into the earth where Rust had been digging. The first few inches came up easily, loose dirt that had been disturbed by the dog's persistent work. But beneath that, the ground was harder, packed down by years of weather and weight. Orville worked methodically, creating a hole that grew wider with each shovelful. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cool night air. His muscles burned from the effort, but he didn't stop. 3 feet down, the shovel struck something solid. The impact sent a jolt through Orville's arms, a sensation different from hitting rock or clay. He knelt at the edge of the hole, brushing away dirt with his hands. Wood. Old wood. Dark with age but still solid. His fingers traced the surface, finding the edges of what appeared to be a large timber beam. His heart hammered in his chest as he dug around the edges, revealing more of the structure. It wasn't just a single beam. It was part of something larger, a framework built with deliberate precision. The wood had been treated somehow, preserved against decay. Whoever had constructed this had intended for it to last. Orville sat back on his heels, staring at what he had uncovered. This was no accident. No forgotten remnant of some old building. This had been built here intentionally, buried deliberately, and his father had known about it. The canvas structure above wasn't just marking the spot. It was protecting it, keeping people away through ridicule and shame, making sure no one would ever think to dig here. The sound of hoofbeats on the road made Orville freeze. He remained still, watching as a rider passed in the distance. Even in the darkness, Orville recognized the horse. Sterling Maddox. The merchant rode slowly, deliberately, his attention fixed on Orville's property. He stopped completely for a long moment, and though Orville had extinguished his lantern, he wondered if Sterling had seen the glow before it went dark. Rust growled low in his throat, a warning sound the dog rarely made. Orville placed a hand on the animal's head, quieting him. Sterling finally continued on, but the encounter sent ice through Orville's veins. What was Sterling doing riding past at this hour? Had someone mentioned seeing unusual activity? Was the merchant's curiosity finally turning into active investigation? The moment had shattered Orville's sense of solitude. He was not as alone as he had thought. People were watching. Sterling was watching. And now, with this discovery, the stakes had changed completely. If Sterling suspected anything valuable on this property, he would find a way to claim it. The law favored men like him, men with money and influence. A poor rancher claiming treasure on his own land would face challenges from every direction. Orville made a decision in that moment. He would continue digging, but only at night. He would maintain his normal routines during the day, giving no indication that anything had changed. The canvas structure would stay exactly as it was, torn and ridiculous, continuing to serve its purpose as a shield of mockery that kept people from looking too closely. He spent the next hour carefully reburying the wooden structure, smoothing the dirt back into place, making sure no sign of his excavation remained visible in daylight. It went against every instinct to cover up what he had just discovered, but caution demanded it. His father had waited decades to reveal even the smallest hint of what lay here. Orville could wait a few more days to uncover it properly. As he worked, his mind raced with questions. How deep did the structure go? What was inside? Who had built it? And when? His father had been a young man when he inherited this land. Had he discovered the structure himself? Or had it been passed down through generations? A secret kept within the family for longer than Orville could imagine. The canvas above him flapped in the night breeze, that familiar sound that had accompanied his entire life. He had heard it every day, had mended and maintained it countless times, never understanding its true purpose. The shame he had carried for so long began to transform into something else. Not pride exactly, but a sense of being part of something larger than himself. His father had not been a fool. He had been a guardian, and now that role had passed to Orville. Rust nuzzled against his leg as Orville finished covering the hole. The dog seemed satisfied, as if he had accomplished his mission by leading Orville to the discovery. Orville knelt and scratched behind the animal's ears, grateful for the instinct that had driven Rust to dig in that exact spot. Tomorrow he would return to town if needed, would endure more mockery, would play the role everyone expected of him. But tomorrow night, he would return to this spot and dig deeper. Whatever lay beneath that wooden structure, whatever his father had spent his life protecting, Orville would uncover it. And when he did, everything would change. Over the next 3 nights, working in darkness and silence, Orville continued his careful excavation. Each night he would wait until the settlement lights dimmed before descending to his work. Each morning before dawn, he would cover his progress, smoothing the dirt to hide any trace of disturbance. The wooden structure revealed itself piece by piece, a framework built around a sealed chamber, constructed with the kind of precision that spoke of experienced hands and careful planning. The entrance revealed itself on the 4th night. A wooden hatch, sealed with pitch and covered by layers of protective timber. Orville ran his hands over the surface, feeling the craftsmanship beneath decades of burial. Someone had built this to last, to remain hidden and intact through years of weather and settlement above. The pitch had hardened, but not cracked. The wood showed no signs of rot. Breaking the seal required careful work. Orville used his knife to scrape away the pitch, working around the edges until he could see where the hatch might lift. His hands trembled as he worked, not from cold or exhaustion, but from the weight of what he was about to discover. Everything his father had endured, every moment of struggle and isolation, had been in service of protecting this moment. The hatch lifted with surprising ease once the seal was broken. The hinges, though old, had been crafted well enough to function even after their long burial. A draft of stale air rose from the opening, carrying a scent of dry earth and old wood. Orville held the lantern over the opening and looked down. Steps, wooden steps leading down into darkness. The chamber went deeper than he had imagined, carved into the earth itself, and reinforced with timber supports. Whoever had built this had not simply buried something. They had created a space meant to preserve and protect. Orville descended carefully, testing each step before trusting it with his full weight. The wood held firm. At the bottom, the lantern light revealed a space roughly 10 feet square, lined with wooden planks that had been fitted together with remarkable skill. The air was dry, surprisingly so, suggesting some kind of ventilation or drainage system that had kept moisture away. 3 large wooden chests sat against the far wall. Orville approached them slowly, his breath shallow. The first chest was not locked. The lid opened with a creak that seemed impossibly loud in the enclosed space. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were objects that caught the lantern light with unmistakable gleam. Coins, gold and silver coins, more than Orville had seen in his entire life. He picked one up, feeling its weight, seeing the unfamiliar markings on its surface. These were old, older than the settlement, perhaps older than anyone living nearby could remember. Beneath the coins, more cloth-wrapped bundles. Orville unwrapped one to find jewelry, pieces that spoke of wealth and craftsmanship from another time. Another bundle contained small bars of silver, stamped with marks he didn't recognize. The chest was filled with wealth, more wealth than Sterling Maddox or Wade Langston or anyone in that settlement could claim. Orville sat back, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This was what his father had protected. This was what the canvas structure had been marking all those years. Not just the location, but the legacy. His hands shook as he reached for the second chest. This one contained documents, papers sealed in waxed containers, protected from moisture and decay. Orville opened one carefully, unfolding pages covered in careful handwriting. The words were difficult to read in the lantern light, but he could make out enough to understand. These were records, accounts, names and dates and descriptions of what had been placed here and why. The third chest remained closed for now. Orville needed time to understand what he had already found before discovering more. He sat on the bottom step, holding one of the documents, trying to piece together the story it was telling. Colonists, conflicts, the need to hide valuables from those who would take them by force, families who had entrusted their possessions to a few chosen guardians, people who would mark the location and keep it secret until the danger passed. But the danger had never fully passed. The settlements had grown, but the memory of what had been hidden had faded, except in families like his, where the knowledge had been passed down as a duty, a responsibility that could never be spoken aloud or shared. His father had known, his grandfather before that. How many generations had stood guard over this spot, maintaining that ridiculous canvas structure, enduring mockery and pressure, never revealing what they protected. Orville climbed back up the steps, emerging into the night air. Rust waited above, tail wagging at his return. The canvas structure flapped overhead, that familiar sound taking on new meaning. This torn, weather-beaten shelter was not a mark of failure. It was a monument to faithfulness, to keeping promises across generations, to protecting something precious even when no one else could see its value. The settlement lights glowed in the distance. Sterling Maddox was probably sleeping soundly in his comfortable home, satisfied in his certainty that Orville Banks was nothing more than a stubborn fool. Wade Langston would be planning his next offer, convinced that poverty would eventually force Orville to sell. Harriet Weller would be preparing her next bit of gossip, finding entertainment in someone else's struggle. None of them knew. None of them could imagine. The man they mocked, the property they scorned, the canvas shelter they ridiculed as an eyesore. It was all standing guard over something that would change everything. And Orville had just opened the door to a truth that had been waiting decades to be revealed. Orville spent the next 2 days reading the documents by daylight in his small cabin. The pages spread across his table, while Rust slept by the door. The handwriting was old but clear, telling a story that reached back further than he had imagined. The dates on the documents confirmed what he had suspected. Over 100 years had passed since these items were sealed underground. Families fleeing disputes over land and resources had pooled their valuables, choosing 3 trusted men to hide and protect their wealth until safety returned. His great-grandfather had been one of those 3. The other 2 guardians had died without heirs, their knowledge dying with them. Only Orville's family line had continued, passing the secret down through careful whispers and deathbed warnings. The documents listed every item in those chests. Coins from settlements that no longer existed, jewelry that had belonged to families whose names had been forgotten, silver bars marked with stamps from trading posts that had vanished into history. The 3rd chest, according to the records, contained land deeds and legal papers that proved ownership of properties stretching across the territory, properties that current occupants believed they owned free and clear, never knowing the original claims still existed, sealed and preserved underground. Orville understood now why his father had never revealed this truth until his final moments. The knowledge was dangerous. Men would kill for this wealth. They would use lawyers and false documents to claim it belonged to them. They would argue that Orville had no right to something buried before his birth, and men like Sterling Maddox, with their influence and connections, would find ways to twist the law in their favor. The canvas structure above ground suddenly made perfect sense. It had served 2 purposes. First, it marked the exact location, so the guardian family would always know where to dig. Second, it made the property appear worthless. No one wanted land with an eyesore sitting in the middle of it. No one would buy property that came with the obligation to maintain that ridiculous torn shelter. The mockery had been intentional, cultivated through generations, a shield of shame that kept greedy eyes looking elsewhere. Orville descended into the chamber again on the 3rd night, this time prepared to face whatever the final chest contained. The lid was heavier than the others, and when he lifted it, he understood why. Inside were the land deeds, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled cloth. He lifted them carefully, setting them aside to reveal what lay beneath. More coins, but these were different. Larger, heavier, marked with official seals. Currency meant for major transactions, not everyday trade. And beneath those, a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of precious stones. Orville opened the pouch, pouring the contents into his palm. Gems caught the lantern light, throwing fragments of color across the chamber walls. These were not rough stones. They had been cut and polished, ready for setting in jewelry or selling to wealthy buyers. The value represented here exceeded anything Orville could calculate. This was not just wealth. This was the kind of fortune that changed everything it touched. He sat in that underground chamber for a long time, holding those stones, thinking about his father working the land above, enduring poverty and struggle while sitting on top of unimaginable riches. His father could have taken just 1 coin, 1 piece of jewelry, and improved their lives dramatically, but he never had. The trust placed in his family was absolute. The responsibility was sacred. Nothing in these chests belonged to them. They were merely guardians, keepers of a promise made generations ago. But the families who had entrusted this wealth were gone. The documents listed names. But Orville knew those bloodlines had scattered or ended. No one remained to claim these possessions. No one except the guardian family who had kept faith across decades of silence and sacrifice. Orville carefully returned everything to the chests, his mind working through the implications. He could take this wealth and leave, disappear to some distant place where no one knew him, where Sterling's influence held no power. He could live comfortably for the rest of his life, but that would mean abandoning the property, leaving the chamber unsealed, potentially allowing others to discover what remained. Or he could stay, claim the wealth openly, produce the documents as proof of the legitimate history, face the challenges that would inevitably come from men who would see this discovery as an opportunity to enrich themselves, fight for what 3 generations of his family had protected. As he climbed back up the steps and emerged into the night air, Orville realized he had already made his choice. His father had endured mockery and poverty rather than betray the trust placed in their family. Orville would not be the one to break that line of faithfulness, but he would also not let this discovery remain hidden forever. The families who had entrusted this wealth were gone, but their memory deserved to be honored. And Orville deserved to claim what his family had earned through generations of sacrifice. The canvas structure flapped overhead, and for the first time, Orville smiled at the sound. That torn, ridiculous shelter had protected something precious for longer than anyone in the settlement could remember. It had turned shame into strength, mockery into shield. The town had laughed at his eyesore for years, never knowing they were staring directly at something extraordinary and seeing nothing at all. Tomorrow would begin the careful process of planning his next move. He needed someone he could trust, someone who would understand the weight of what he had discovered, someone who would help him navigate the dangerous path between silence and revelation. And there was only one person in the settlement who had ever treated him with genuine respect. Nora Talbot's boarding house sat at the quiet end of the settlement, far enough from the main road to avoid the constant traffic, but close enough to serve travelers who needed a place to rest. Orville had known her for years, had watched her maintain her independence after her husband died, had seen her weather her own share of hardship with a dignity that reminded him of his father. She was one of the few people who had never treated him with contempt. He found her sweeping the front steps in the morning light, her movements efficient and practiced. She looked up as he approached, and something in her expression changed. A sharpening of focus, as if she had been waiting for something to shift in him and had just seen it happen. "You look different," she said, leaning the broom against the wall. "Not tired. That's new." Orville paused at the bottom of the steps, suddenly uncertain. Coming here felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that once he spoke, there would be no taking the words back. Nora watched him with those steady eyes, patient as always, giving him time to find his voice. "I need to talk to someone," he said finally. "Someone who knew my father." Nora nodded slowly, gesturing toward the door. "Come inside." The boarding house was quiet, empty of guests at this hour. Nora poured coffee from a pot on the stove, setting a cup in front of Orville at her small kitchen table. She sat across from him waiting. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind that came from years of occasional conversations, brief moments of connection, in a place where both of them existed on the margins of community acceptance. "My father told me something before he died," Orville began, his hands wrapped around the warm cup, "about never selling the land, about things being worth more than money. I didn't understand it then." "And now you do?" Nora's voice was gentle, curious without being pushy. Orville met her eyes. "Now I do." She studied him for a long moment, reading something in his face that made her lean back in her chair. "Your father was a good man, stubborn but good. People thought he was foolish for hanging on to that property. I never did." "Why not?" Nora smiled slightly. "Because I knew him when he was younger, before life wore him down. He had this quality about him, this certainty, like he knew something no one else knew. Your mother saw it too. That's why she married him, I think. She believed there was more to him than what showed on the surface." The mention of his mother, dead now for many years, sent a pang through Orville's chest. She had never known the truth either. His father had carried that burden alone, even keeping it from the woman he loved. The weight of that isolation must have been crushing. "I found something," Orville said quietly. "On the property." Under the canvas structure, Nora's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Understanding, perhaps, or confirmation of a long-held suspicion. What did you find? Something that changes everything. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of those words settling between them. Nora took a sip of her coffee, her gaze never leaving his face. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of caution, mixed with something that might have been excitement. Are you going to tell me what it is? Or are you going to make me guess? Orville found himself smiling, a genuine expression that felt strange on his face. I need your help, your counsel. Before I do anything, I need to know I'm thinking clearly. Nora leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. Then tell me everything. He did. The words came slowly at first, then faster as the story unfolded. Rust's digging, the wooden structure, the chamber, the chests filled with wealth beyond imagination, the documents explaining how his family had been chosen as guardians generations ago, the land deeds that could upend property claims across the territory, the impossible choice between keeping silent and revealing a truth that would shake the settlement to its foundation. Nora listened without interrupting, her face showing a range of emotions as the story progressed. Surprise, then understanding, then something that looked like vindication. When he finished, she sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Your father protected that secret, his whole life, she said. Kept it even from you until the very end. That took strength most men don't have. I don't know if I'm strong enough to handle what comes next, Orville admitted. The moment I reveal this, everything changes. Sterling will find a way to challenge my claim. Wade will argue the land should be his. Every person with influence will suddenly have an opinion about what should happen to that wealth. Nora reached across the table, placing her hand over his. The gesture was simple but carried a weight of meaning. You're stronger than you think. Your father knew that. That's why he trusted you with this. The touch of her hand against his sent an unexpected warmth through Orville's chest. Not desire exactly, but connection, recognition, the understanding that he was not alone in this moment, that someone saw him clearly and believed in his capacity to handle what lay ahead. Her fingers were work-worn like his, marked by years of maintaining her independence in a world that often dismissed women who chose to stand alone. What would you do? He asked. Nora considered the question carefully. I would document everything first. Make copies of those papers. Find someone outside this settlement who could verify their authenticity. Then I would claim what is rightfully yours, both by discovery and by inheritance. And I would prepare for the fight that will follow. Will you help me? She squeezed his hand gently before withdrawing. I will. Your father was kind to me when others weren't. I owe his memory that much. And you deserve better than what this town has given you. Orville and Nora spent 3 days making careful copies of every document, working in her boarding house where thick walls provided privacy. They documented each item in the chests with detailed descriptions, creating records that would stand up to any challenge. Nora suggested contacting an assessor from the territorial office, someone outside Sterling's sphere of influence who could verify the authenticity and value of what had been found. But Sterling was already moving. On the 4th morning, Orville returned to his property to find Wade Langston standing near the canvas structure with 2 other men. They weren't digging, but they were clearly examining the ground, looking for signs of disturbance. Wade straightened when he saw Orville approaching, his expression caught between guilt and defiance. Interesting thing happened, Wade said, his voice carrying false casualness. Sterling mentioned you've been acting strange lately. Riding past at odd hours, he said your lantern was lit in the middle of the night. Got us wondering what you might be up to out here. Working my land, Orville replied evenly. Same as always. Wade gestured at the canvas structure. This old thing. You know, I was thinking about what you said, about not selling, and I started wondering why a man would cling so hard to worthless property. Unless it wasn't worthless. The other 2 men moved closer, positioning themselves to block Orville's path to the canvas structure. This wasn't a casual visit. This was an attempt at intimidation, a probe to see if Orville would crack under pressure. Sterling had sent them to investigate, to apply force if necessary. You're trespassing, Orville said quietly. We're just talking, Wade countered, having a friendly conversation about property rights. See, Sterling did some research. Turns out there are old claims on land around here. Claims that might supersede current ownership if the right documentation surfaced. Makes a man think about what might be buried under all this dirt. So Sterling had already started planning his legal challenge, even before knowing what existed. The merchant was preparing to argue that anything found belonged to previous claimants whose rights he could somehow acquire or represent. It was exactly the kind of maneuver Orville had feared. "You should leave now," Orville said. Wade smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Or what? You'll do what exactly? Call the law? Sterling has influence with every official in this territory. You think anyone's going to take your word over his?" The moment stretched tight, violence hovering at its edges. Orville could feel the other two men tensing, ready to act if Wade gave the signal. But Rust appeared from behind the canvas structure, his body low and tense, a growl rumbling in his chest. The dog positioned himself between Orville and the three men, teeth bared. Wade took a step back, his confidence faltering. "We'll be going. But this conversation isn't over. Whatever you're hiding here, it won't stay hidden much longer." They left, but Orville knew the confrontation had merely been delayed. Sterling would come next, with more men, with legal papers, with every weapon at his disposal. The merchant had smelled opportunity, and men like Sterling never let opportunity escape their grasp. Orville walked to the canvas structure, his hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. He needed to move faster than he had planned. The assessment from the territorial office wouldn't arrive for another week. Sterling wouldn't wait that long. The merchant would force the issue, would try to seize control before Orville could establish his legitimate claim. That evening, Nora found him pacing in her kitchen, unable to sit still. She listened as he described the confrontation, her expression growing more serious with each detail. "We need to reveal it now," she said. "Tomorrow. Call a public gathering. Show everyone what you found before Sterling can twist the narrative in his favor." "The whole town will side with him," Orville said. "Maybe. But once they see the evidence, once they understand what your family protected all these years, some of them will remember their own history. Some of them will recognize the names in those documents, and even Sterling can't argue with 100 years of documented truth." Orville looked at her, seeing the strength in her eyes, the certainty. She believed in him, believed in the legitimacy of his claim. And more than that, she believed he was capable of standing against Sterling's power. "Tomorrow then," he said. "We show them everything." The settlement hall filled with curious faces as word spread about Orville's announcement. Sterling Maddox sat in the front row, his expression smug with certainty. Wade Langston stood near the door, arms crossed. Harriet Weller whispered to her companions, already preparing the gossip she would spread afterward. They had all come expecting another display of Orville's foolishness, another reason to mock the man who clung to worthless land. Orville stood before them with Nora at his side, the documents spread on a table behind him. His hands were steady now, his voice clear when he spoke. "Most of you know about the canvas structure on my property. You've called it an eyesore, a symbol of my failure. You've mocked it for years, used it as proof that I was too stubborn or too foolish to let go of the past. But that structure was never about failure. It was marking something, protecting something. And 4 days ago, my dog led me to discover what my family has been guarding for over 100 years. The room grew quiet. Sterling's smug expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. Orville gestured to the table. Beneath that torn canvas lies a sealed chamber built by early colonists. Inside are valuables they entrusted to 3 guardian families during times of conflict. My great-grandfather was one of those guardians. The other 2 bloodlines ended. Only mine remained. These documents prove everything. They list every item, explain the history, and establish the legitimate chain of custody across 4 generations. Sterling stood abruptly. Even if this is true, those items belong to the descendants of the original families, not to you. Orville met his eyes. The documents name those families. Most of those bloodlines ended long ago. The few that remain have no knowledge of what was hidden or who protected it. The colonists chose guardians specifically because they trusted them to preserve their legacy. My family kept that trust, endured poverty and ridicule rather than betray it. That sacrifice has earned this claim. Wade stepped forward. You can't just declare ownership. This needs proper legal review. Nora spoke for the first time, her voice calm, but firm. An assessor from the territorial office is already en route. He'll verify everything, but the documentation is clear and complete. The law recognizes guardian rights in cases where original claimants cannot be found or have abandoned their claims. Orville's family never abandoned anything. They stood guard for a century. The room erupted in conversation, some voices raised in support, others in challenge. But the tone had shifted. People were no longer dismissing Orville as a fool. They were grappling with the reality that the man they had mocked for years had been protecting something extraordinary. Sterling tried to marshal arguments, but each one crumbled against the documented evidence. The dates, the seals, the detailed inventory, the historical record that confirmed every claim Orville made. Even Sterling's influence couldn't override truth, this thoroughly established. In the weeks that followed, the territorial assessor confirmed everything. The items were authentic, the documents legitimate. Some of the old land deeds caused disputes among current property owners, but Orville chose not to press those claims. He had enough, more than enough. The canvas structure still stands on his property, but Orville repaired it properly, transforming it from eyesore to memorial, a marker of faithfulness kept across generations. The town's mockery turned to grudging respect, then to something approaching admiration. Nora helps him manage the wealth now, her practical wisdom complementing his careful stewardship. They work together most days, planning how to honor the memory of those colonists and the sacrifice of Orville's ancestors. Rust sleeps in the shade of the canvas structure, his work complete, the secret he helped uncover now preserved in history rather than hidden in darkness. And Orville Banks, once the settlement's favorite failure, walks the main street with his head high, knowing that what others see as worthless often protects what is most valuable. The torn tent taught the town a lesson they would never forget. Sometimes the things we mock the most are guarding treasures we cannot begin to imagine. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where justice and courage collide in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these.